Hello and welcome to today's video. It's great to have you back. I hope you're doing great and you're enjoying yourself. You also get confused sometimes when you open a camera settings menu and you see all these technical abbreviations, a lot of technical jargons like NTSC, 1080p, PAL, 720p, MP4, XAVC, and whatever there is. Well, I get that all the time. And that's why I thought in this video I'm actually going to break down what you really need to know if you're a hobbyist and you just want to get the basic settings right. If you are new here, my name is Michael. I'm an enthusiastic hobby videographer and my goal on this channel is to help you create great videos to relive exciting moments and share with others. But now let's get into the topic of basic camera settings. I'm gonna break this down in 4 different chunks. The first one is gonna be PAL versus NTSC. Then I'm gonna talk about frame rates and then about recording formats and video compression, and last but not least about resolution and aspect ratio. Let's start with the first one. NTSC versus PAL. These are basically 2 analog TV color systems that was used in analog TV. So it doesn't have the same importance as it used to be, but there are still 2 reasons why it is important to have a basic understanding of it. The first is because it affects what kind of frame rates you can choose, and the second one is it can cause some flickering if you're filming in artificial light. Why is that? The flickering is basically caused if the frequency of the electricity which powers the lights is not in line with the frequency on your camera. For the NTSC standards, mainly used in North America, the frequency of the electricity is 60 Hz, and in Europe and pretty much in the rest of the world it's 50 Hz. And that's also what the PAL system has. But you don't need to necessarily switch between PAL and NTSC because you can also fix that by just increasing the shutter speed. And the other point which is important is that it affects your frame rate. So basically the NTSC standard has a base frame rate of 30 frames per second and the PAL standard has a base frame rate of 25 frames per second. So if you go into your camera menu setting, for example, and you want to set a base frame rate for 30 frames per second and you see it's not available, there is only showing 25, 50 or 100, you know, my camera is in the PAL, so I need to switch it to NTSC to be able to choose 30 frames per second. So why does this even matter? It's important because if you are shooting with different cameras, so for example, in my case, I often use my mirrorless camera, my drone or my GoPro, and I want to make sure that my base frame rate is the same for all these cameras. So I want to make sure that all the cameras are set in the same standard. And now that brings me to the second point, frame rates. What is it and why does it even matter? Well, as you know, video is basically nothing else than a lot of pictures just played very quickly after each other. And so frame rate, or FPS, frames per second, will just tell you how many pictures are recorded within 1 second. So 30 frames per second, meaning 30 pictures are recorded in 1 second. As I mentioned before, the base frame rate for NTSC is 30 frames per second and for PAL is 25 frames per second. Yet the standard frame rate that is used in Hollywood for movies is 24 frames per second, which usually is only available on the NTSC standard. Then high frame rates, it's always a multiple of the standard frame rate. So for NTSC you have 60, you have 120, for PAL you have 50, you have 100. And what does this do? So basically, if your base frame rate is 30 frames per second and you record in 120 frames per second, but then you play it back in your base frame rate, it slows your footage down to 25%. And that's what we call slow motion. But so which base frame rate do you need to choose? Well, in the end, it actually doesn't really matter. But I would recommend going for one of the standard basic frame rates. As mentioned before, it's just important that you have the same base frame rate across all your cameras you are using and go with it. Now we still have 2 more chunks to cover, but before that, let me quickly grab a cup of coffee and then let's talk about recording formats and video compression codecs. Excellent, so that's done. And now let's continue. So the next confusing thing often is when you look at the different formats that you can choose. For Sony cameras, which I use, it's XAVCS HD and then XAVCS 4K, and then you have some other formats that you can actually choose. And each format has a different compression codec behind it. What does this mean? So basically, your camera, when it records, it will compress it into a file format that is easily readable by any video player or video editing software. So not all the information that is captured with the camera is actually put into this file, and that's why you need a compression, so that the file size is going to be a little bit lower. If you look at professional cameras, they often have the ability that they can record in RAW, which is uncompressed, but these are huge files, and the benefit of this is you can do heavy color grading and adjusting because just more information is packed into it. If you compare it to photography, it's pretty much the same when you take a picture in RAW format versus in JPEG. So the JPEG would then be your compressed file, and for video it's the same. The most common video format is the compression codec called H.264, which is pretty much every GoPro, your mobile phone, and pretty much most of consumer cameras, they use this codec to put your file into an MP4 file in the end, which is universally readable by pretty much any video player and video editing software. So the format determines the quality of your video file in the end. Basically, as a rule of thumb, the higher the compression, the lower the file size, but also the lower the quality. Whereas the format does impact the quality of the footage, it is not to be confused with the resolution. So meaning less quality doesn't necessarily mean a lower resolution. And that brings me to the fourth point, resolution and aspect ratio. So resolution basically determines how many pixels are recorded on your frame. Common terms, what you've heard is 720p, 1080p or 4K. So the resolution in 720p is 1280 million pixels times 720 million pixels, and for 1080p it's 1920 times 1080 million pixels. And 4K would be double the pixels of 1080p, which is 3840 times 2160. And all these common resolutions, they have an aspect ratio of 16 times 9. So that's the standard aspect ratio that is used for video. Some cameras will let you choose a different aspect ratio, something like 4:3 or 5:4, but you just need to make sure that if you choose a different aspect ratio, make sure that your other cameras are having the same aspect ratio as well. Otherwise, what you will need to do later when you're editing is crop in so that you're gonna end up in a 16:9 aspect ratio as well. Now you could ask, what is the best resolution to use? And that is always kind of, it depends, right? Usually the higher the resolution, the better the quality, but also the bigger the file size are going to be. And the more computing power will be needed to edit the whole footage. And that's it. I hope this was helpful and you are now more clear of which settings you need to touch to set the baseline for video. So basically, choose your base frame rate and set NTSC or PAL accordingly. Choose your recording format and resolution and the aspect ratio that goes with it. And the most important thing, no matter what you choose, make sure it's the same across all your cameras. But that's enough for today. So I hope you did learn something. If you did, give this video a like, subscribe if you want to learn more, because next week I am going to cover basic exposure settings. So basically what you need to fiddle around when you are actually shooting. And until then, I wish you a great week ahead. Stay safe and healthy, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.